Okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about Black families and specifically how that is leading to a lot of problems. But not only that, where did this come from? Why did the Black family fall apart? Has it always been broken like this? Is it caused by slavery? Well, let's take a look here. So first off, you're going to notice something, okay? The Black broken family rate or illegitimacy rate, the number of kids growing up without a dad in the home, is at 72% now, okay? Now let's go back to the 1950s. It was below 20% in 1950, okay? Remember, in 1950, things were real racist in the United States. So how could you say that racism caused the breakup of the Black family if the family broke up from 1950 till today, and from 1950 to today, racism has been on the decline, okay? People are far less racist. There's much more freedom for Blacks today than in 1950. So you can't say that racism caused the breakup of the Black family when the data literally says the exact opposite. As racism declined, the Black family became more and more broken up. But why is that? What caused it, right? So let's take a look at that. That's what I want to look at. And first of all, I want to start by looking a little bit at the history of kind of the Blacks, the Black community in the 20th century. Now, one of the first things we should realize is that coming out of the 1800s, most Blacks worked in agriculture. However, there's a thing called the Great Migration. This is when a ton of people that lived in the South, specifically a lot of Blacks, moved north to places like Detroit. Now let's take a look at Detroit, for instance. It says, during the first wave of the Great Migration, thousands of African Americans settled in Detroit as part of the total 1.5 million Blacks who left the South during the first half of the 20th century looking for opportunities in the Northeast and Midwest. What opportunities are they talking about? They're talking about city jobs, specifically in the manufacturing sector, which really were taking off in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And so what happened was there's a large number of Blacks who moved into the cities. Remember, Blacks didn't originally, they weren't a city group. They were country people during the 1800s. They literally lived outside of the cities mainly and worked in agriculture as either slaves and then later as farm laborers. But that changed in the first half of the 20th century as they moved into these cities to work manufacturing jobs. So let's take a look at what happened to manufacturing post 1950, like after the 50s and the 60s, 70s. Okay, let's just take a look. Oh boy. Well, service jobs took off, automation took off, and outsourcing took off. A lot of the jobs that used to be these city jobs that a lot of the Blacks worked in were either automated or outsourced. Okay, now that wasn't racism, that was just economic policy and just technological change with time. And so what happened was in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, a lot of these people that used to have these jobs in cities like Detroit, where a Black man could get a decent job working in a factory or something and support a family, even though he lived in a time of extreme racism, that started to go away. It began to become very, very difficult. Okay? Not only that, so there's less jobs out there for Blacks as things are getting outsourced or automated. You also have, look what happens with illegal immigration. It explodes after the 1960s. Starting in the late 1960s, it begins to go up and up and up and up. And what happens is now you have less jobs available for kind of lower to mid-skill workers that are, what large portions of the Black community are made up of. And then you have more people competing for those jobs, which also helps to explain some of the tension between the African American community and the Hispanic community. So what happens? Okay. Where do these, Black men begin to turn to try and make a living? Well, also in the 1960s, something else began to take off, drugs. And what happened is that Black men who didn't have good economic prospects found that they could find camaraderie. They could also find a way to make money and respect and dignity from their peers by joining into these gangs, which would go out. A gang is essentially an illegal business. And that's what they were in the streets doing. They were fighting to preserve and to promote and to expand their businesses. There weren't a lot of jobs. Now, I'm not saying that that's, that's justified. It's good to go out and deal drugs. It's not. It's bad. But at the same time, these people have been squeezed into a very difficult position. So you have poverty is a big problem here. There's not a lot of economic prospects for blacks. There was better economic prospects, or at least things were getting better. There was less disparity in the incomes. Or I don't know, maybe there's still a lot of disparity, but there still was economic kind of, there was an economic net there to some extent where blacks were moving in large numbers to some of these northern cities. Now, let's take a look at what the government did in the 1960s that really messed up things, specifically related to the family. And I'm going to let Thomas Sowell, an absolute expert scholar on this, in his recent book, Discrimination and Disparities, he talks about some of this. You should really read the book. This is just a brief conversation he's having about the book that touches on this subject.
One more instance of this kind of retrogression, the family. Again, discrimination and disparities. As of 1960, this one, I just find this one heartbreaking. As of 1960, 2/3 of all Black American children were living with both parents. That declined over the years until only 1/3 were living with both parents in 1995. Among Black families in poverty, 85% of the children had no father present, close quote. So it's not the legacy of slavery that destroys the African-American
It's the legacy of the welfare state.
And by the way, we see illegitimacy rates rising among everybody.
Yeah, and in other countries.
And
the very same thing in England.
And what's the mechanism? Why does the welfare state dissolve the family structure?
For one thing, it makes it unnecessary for fathers to support their offspring. And in fact, it makes it counterproductive in many cases. A very poor man who might be able to support his family realizes his family will be better off without him. But on the other hand, someone who's strictly irresponsible, either the man or the woman or both, now pays no price for being irresponsible. The taxpayers pay the price. And actually the harm done to the taxpayers, which is serious, still is not comparable to the harm done to the families, especially the children.
To the kids.
Yeah. Moynihan was excoriated for pointing this out.
So, I mean, I want to just examine what we just listened to there, okay? He's basically, what he's saying is what I was kind of talking about. You have this poverty that is creating lots of problems, and all of a sudden now there is an incentive. There's an incentive now in the 60s. Look at this graph in the late 60s. Immediately it begins to go up really sharply. Why? It's because now it actually pays to be single. If you're not married, you get more money from the government. You get more help. And so suddenly these blacks that are dealing with poverty suddenly realize that they can get more assistance from the state than they could from than their poor prospects that they have. Do you see how it creates this economic incentive to destroy your family and to break up the family? And not only that, all groups began to see it. Now, there's one other thing that happened in the 1960s. It's the sexual revolution. All across the world, you began to see all of the illegitimacy rates amongst all groups, as you can see, begin to increase. Okay. Obviously, there's an economic incentive, but there also was a social and cultural change where people began to kind of see that family was less important. There was more sexual freedom. The pill made it, easier for people to kind of go out and sleep around more. And so all of these things combined to create a bad circumstance where the Black family begins to fall apart. So to kind of summarize here, you have economic reasons that push Blacks into poverty with outsourcing, illegal immigration, automation, all of these sorts of things that kind of robbed a lot of Black men of their ability to make a decent living for their families. You then have the state step in and say, hey, look, if this guy can't support you, we'll support you. Again, de-incentivizing and not only that, pay you more if you're not married. Single moms need more help because there's no income coming into their house officially. So suddenly the husband or baby daddy is kind of helping out, but the woman is getting, a good check from the government. You kind of break up that family even more. And the sexual revolution continues to break it apart. All of these factors combined. You'll notice that what's not present in this, racism. Okay. It wasn't racism that broke up the family. In fact, the family was very stable under the worst racist times, which is terrible. It's bad, but it isn't what drove it. We see the increases in the breakup of Black families happen after racism begins to be broken apart. Okay, as we begin to see segregation end, as people begin to become more accepting. I mean, you can't make the argument that we're less accepting in 2010 of Black people and than we were in 1950. Okay, so the data doesn't match the narrative that racism drove the breakup of the Black family. Economics did, bad incentives did, bad government policy did, cultural change did. And until we correct these problems, we're not going to help the Black community. Ultimately, the Black community has massive problems with crime. And that massive problem with violent crime in their community leads to more police being there, bad police interactions. And the reason that they have more violent crime is because you have literally almost all of the Black young men growing up without a father in the home. And young men who grow up without fathers end up being more violent. That's just, it doesn't matter what their race is. And why don't they have why don't they have fathers in the home? Well, because there are policies that have created incentives for people who are poor not to marry and not to have a cohesive family. So until we address some of these problems, and I'm not giving the total solution in this video, but until we address these problems, we can't help the Black community. And ultimately, that's what I'm about. Okay? There's a lot of people out there who like to virtue signal and kind of talk about, how much they care about Blacks and, it's all about racism. And it's all virtue signaling nonsense because you're not taking the time to actually understand what's actually driving these problems. If you want to help this community, you need to recognize what's actually causing the problem. Yes, there's discrimination. Yes, there's racism, but it is not a primary driver of these kinds of problems. And until we diagnose the problem properly, and get rid of morons like Colin Kaepernick out there acting like racism is the primary driver and the primary cause of these sorts of issues, you're not going to see an improvement. And frankly, that's unacceptable to me because I care about the Black community. I want them to thrive. But until we get the right message out and listen to brilliant Black scholars like Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, and a variety of other voices out there like Larry Elder, Talib Starks, these guys know what's going on and they're talking about it and no one's listening. And the reason they're not listening is because there's political incentives to keep the Black community where it is, because the Black community where it is relies on the government. And when they rely on the government, if you rob Peter to pay Paul, you can always count on Paul's vote. And so you got creeps like Biden and others who literally use this sort of racial narrative and that they're the great white savior to keep them voting for Democrat elites who run these god-awful hellhole cities that have not been prosperous since the 1950s and 60s because of these sorts of policies. So until we fix the root cause of the problem, we're not going to have a solution.